Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I know people are joining from around the world, actually, quite a few in the UK, but also the US and elsewhere. So, hi from Paris. Oh, hello to you too, Ingrid. Very nice to see you joining us. Yeah, we're very excited to share with you what we've been working on today, which is our webinar focused on brand reputation, specifically with regard to some of the recent Boeing situation, which we're using as a bit of a case study, but then using that as a launching pad to talk a bit more broadly about reputation and what you can do and what brands can do to safeguard that. So I'm going to share my screen now and give the team a chance to introduce themselves. Okay, I hope you'll see my screen. So as I said, today's webinar is all about brand reputation. And before I launch into that and let the guys introduce themselves, just wanted to quickly say who we are as a whole, who we are as Pulsar. So a lot of you will already be familiar with this, but Pulsar is an audience intelligence company. And that basically means we help organizations understand their audiences. So we look at the conversations taking place online, and that's via a SaaS platform and also via our in-house insights team, who are represented here today by Alex, the other Alex, for the sake of clarity. And yeah, we combine a lot of signals from conversations, from behavioral data. We run it through things like AI, a number of smart algorithms, a lot of different tools to hopefully arrive at the story, insights we need to like craft strategy that allows you to get the right messaging, reach the right people, and all that kind of thing. But now I'd also like to ask the guys to introduce themselves. Alex, do you want to kick things off?
Yeah, for sure. Very nice to be here. I'm Alex, other Alex W from Pulsar. I work as an associate director in Pulsar's research team, working closely with a number of our clients on bespoke research methodologies and ad hoc projects as well, including a fair bit of work on reputation intelligence.
Hi, Kelly.
Hi, I'm very happy to be here too. I'm Kelly Scott and I'm the VP of Account Management over at Vulio, which is Pulsar's sister brand. We focus on the PR comms, political and stakeholder side of things.
Awesome. And I'm Alex. I'm in the marketing team at Pulsar. And the hope here is getting the three of us together is we'll be able to look at Boeing and the reputation, Boeing more generally, and hopefully offer up some, mutually reinforcing, complementary viewpoints. So obviously Kelly has this wealth of experience in the PR and comms space, so she'll be able to tell us hopefully quite a lot about what the people in these companies might be thinking and what might be next for them as well. And then Alex obviously has more that approach where he's looking at things from like the how stories spread and what like brands can do and bringing the data and the analysis side into things. So Boeing, we're going to launch things pretty much straight off with this chart here. I'm pretty sure if you're on this call, you probably know what happened. Namely that on a Alaska Airlines flight heading to Portland, a door blew out and all hell broke loose. And obviously that was all hell breaking loose, both in the context of the cabin, which I would imagine was probably quite terrifying to be in at the time, but also in terms of Boeing's reputation and what that spelt for them as a brand and how it's still going on. I think if anyone goes into Twitter, X, or Google, this morning, you type in Boeing, you will just see an absolute flood of articles, posts. This is very much still something that's weighing on people's minds. It's very much still having a commercial impact. It's still something that obviously needs addressing by Boeing as a company. So what we see here is the online news on the left, and you see the comments on the posts on X on the right. And putting these two things next to each other is also quite a nice way for us of showing that this is a reputation story with a difference. It's something that reflects the different dynamics that we see in the modern world. Like in this particular instance, you have a very well-known brand like Boeing, like a really established American brand that meets the feverish, hypercharged news cycle you get these days. And also this touches on social, which just massively destabilizes the whole equation. And it just means that there's a new vector for information spread and also a new place where people can form their opinions and disseminate them online. Now, there is a big discrepancy between the spikes on here, which I'd love to explore in a bit more detail in a bit. But before I do that, Kelly, when you see something like this, what's your first thought? Like, what do you think when you see a story, like this play out?
I think from the online news side, obviously the large spike is when it was breaking news, and we had that breaking news element with the door blowing out. But what you see is actually more spikes after it, and that's often how the story begins to evolve through other elements of the news cycle. So, for example, from breaking news more into journalist scrutiny, and also when we begin to see some of the key stakeholders begin to respond or spokespeople enter the conversation. And that was very much what happened here with these spikes, which we can talk a little bit more about a little bit later on. But it really is the kind of almost initial breaking news. Okay, what does this mean? Is this an industry conversation? Who are the people that need to actually comment or are being pushed to comment in the press as well?
Yeah, and as you say, Kelly, we can look at that in a little bit more detail here, in fact. So obviously, here we've just separated out the news element of that. There's a couple of things that I'd probably flag here before opening up the floor to Kelly to share some more of her insights. One of those is that we've already talked a bit about the shape of this and what you can deduce from it. I mean, one thing that I first saw when I saw this chart was the spike doesn't actually seem that big relative to what came before. Certainly when you looked at the social discrepancy, it went up by a factor of about 50. How come this is only going about 7 or 8 times larger? And the reason for that is actually demonstrated by, if you look at the bottom of the chart, when you see those low spikes, they get higher and higher over time. And this is because this news analysis is bringing in a huge amount of industry publications. So even long before Boeing got onto like national press and the mainstream press with this whole blowout situation, it was still being spoken about a lot in anything to do with like economics, infrastructure, finance, obviously travel and aerospace. So there's a huge amount of conversation prior to it. And as we'll explore in a bit more detail, people were well aware of a lot of these issues long before, it got catapulted onto TV screens in front of all of us. And the reason why I highlight those lower spikes is if you look beforehand, what you might see is these are happening at quite a regular interval. And that basically is the weekend. And that's one of the reasons that we can tell this is an industry publication-led conversation. Whereas you look more recently and the biggest spike, I believe, happens on a Saturday. So that already, besides the size of the spike and the numbers, just the fact that's happened on a Saturday would be a first warning indicator. Well, hang on, the weekend's normally quite, low, and now the weekend's exploded. And obviously that's because the whole Boeing story kicked off at that time. Kelly, I don't know, I want to open the floor to you. What do you think when you see this?
I actually really agree. And also you mentioned about the economic side of some of the earlier spikes. Boeing is one of the biggest exporters, if not the biggest by dollar value in America. The health of Boeing is often in the press and in the financial press, as it's often an indicator for the health of other things. So we do see it get some press coverage, but it's not a consumer company. So it doesn't tend to get it. Their customers are airlines. So the conversation tends to be very specific. When the spike did happen, and just looking at what happened after the breaking news, that's when we begin to see, initially there was a reaction where you saw airlines speaking to the press, demanding accountability. They were obviously, especially those in the States who tend to have mainly Boeing stock, they wanted to see some action around these safety concerns. And that probably relates heavily to what we saw online with the consumer reaction and the fears and the panic around the safety of the industry. As we began to move through from the initial spike and around about the 28th of January, there was a really kind of a bit of a change. And we began to see that journalist investigation into what's going on behind the scenes and a little bit more into what's going on in the industry. And we saw some really interesting headlines from the likes of the FT, who did a real long read, and it's those weekend papers that weekend articles that you mentioned, and that we began to see more of, which was that journalistic scrutiny. One of their articles was how Boeing's troubles are upsetting the balance of power in aviation, and it was a real deep dive into the duopoly of the industry. So for those of you who might not be aware, in this sector we have two main manufacturers, which is Airbus and Boeing, who work as a duopoly to provide. There are some very small players, but they're not really anywhere near even 1%. So this market is very much owned by those two, and currently it's about 60% Airbus to 40% Boeing. And this idea of a duopoly is a question mark, for some people. And when you see these kind of questions, when you see one of the main players falter to this degree, these questions about the industry begin to kind of rise up. And so there was a number of kind of really interesting under the bonnet articles that were coming through, some global publications at this time questioning the industry. And what that led to, when we kind of get a bit further down the road, is we begin to see what I'd call key stakeholders, such as the European regulator, the ESA, who regulates aviation in Europe, bearing in mind that the plane in question that had the issues and still has the issues, the Boeing 737 MAX, there wasn't any stock in any European airlines of that plane. It's quite a specific plane. Even so, they felt they had to comment, and that they actually gave a statement to Reuters on the fact that if they did have some stock, or if there were further concerns, they would do something about it. And that shows that actually when we're taking this conversation way beyond a single event, and it's becoming actually a real exercise in, is this industry working? What do we need to know? What behaviours should we expect from our political and government stakeholders, right through to other kind of organisations? And finally, it's worth me mentioning, we then begin to see a real shift in the way other stakeholders behave. So whereas we initially saw some of those key airlines come out and say we want accountability, by the time we get through to kind of towards the end of March, we have airlines coming out publicly backing Boeing. So, and that's hitting the press lines. Michael O'Leary, who we all know from Ryanair, basically said that, you know, completely backs Boeing. He's reassured by what he sees. Did caveat it a little bit with he expects them to, you know, work a bit harder on safety. But, you know, we begin to see other voices in the industry stepping in and helping kind of try and settle some of the noise down when Boeing is not credible enough to do it itself. And so that's a really fascinating part of this story, which is which voices are playing out in the press in order to kind of settle the situation down. And it's obviously not settled down yet either. So, but I'd say that's the big thing, big kind of insights I saw. And obviously we end the story a little bit on the 25th of March when the CEO, David Colquhoun, said that he's going to step down at the end of the year. That was the key shift that everybody was waiting for in terms of the markets, and also, you know, maybe some of the regulatory bodies who were looking to see that, you know, significant change so that they can begin to reset the story, reset belief in the industry. And it'd be really fascinating to see from here how we go through the year as these more structural changes take place, whether that does impact that online consumer conversation of those that are the customers of Boeing's customers.
Yeah, no, those are really interesting points, Kelly. I think it's also interesting to hear you project it far forward. I'd love to return to that a bit more because I'm about to take a step back in time, but I'd love to circle back. And when I say take a step back in time, what I wanted to do was look at the state of the news conversation on the day. So I believe it was the 5th into the 6th of January, where the Alaska Airlines incident happened. And I think also very interesting that it transmuted from the Alaska Airlines incident into the Boeing incident, which I believe happened in a matter of days. But again, we'll touch more on that in a second. This is interesting for us because this was taking place, this was a syndicated article that was being published and read literally at the same time, I believe, as the Alaska Airlines incident was taking place. So this just rams home the fact that you know, people were very aware that Boeing had a big problem with the safety of its planes, with its efficiency, with how it was meeting certain regulation. This conversation was very much taking place in the industry among insiders, but it was also getting, you know, a little bit of like crossover beyond that as well into certain audiences. But then obviously on the day of we see in quick succession 2 posts. Again, syndication has an impact here. So CREM is a local Washington-based news source. Obviously, this took place in Portland, which is just over the border. But also you see ABC News, which, you know, obviously is a massive US news institution. And this was within, you know, minutes of the plane landing. Obviously, these articles got updated over time, as liable to happen these days, as people return to them, and journalists added more information as they got it. But this is just, again, a signifier that, number one, yeah, this wasn't happening in a vacuum. There was a lot of media attention on Boeing anyway. And 2, when it did happen, the media were on it immediately, within, you know, barely hours, really, within minutes. But that last post, as you can see, there's a lot of similarity between the Krem one and ABC. Again, this is partly a result of like syndication within the US. But you'll notice one difference is they say, see what happened inside the plane. And that provides a neat segue actually for us to talk about the other side of the equation, which is social. So why did they say see what happened inside the plane? We'll get to that in a second. But before we get into that, I wanted to just call attention to the shape of the spike you see on social. Now, if you remember the previous one, there was that massive spike in news and then a slightly smaller spike afterwards. And what you'll notice here is that the two have been inverted. So this smaller spike, which takes place again on around the 6th, that is on Twitter, people talking about the blower incident. And this second one here is actually to do with the whistleblower at Boeing, who there's a lot of uncertainty, of course, over what happened. And there was a lot of like coroner's reports and things being said online. This is the response online when he was found dead and that was reported. It's quite interesting because it clearly shows that when you're managing reputation as a brand, different platforms play host to different types of conversation, and you really need to be aware of both. And when we say plays host different conversation, obviously a lot of that has to do with the conditions and the context of the platforms themselves. So clearly, reporters cannot speculate to the same extent that posters can online, which means that news reporters are always going to be able to write much more authoritatively and just much more generally about something like the incident itself, where there's concrete information, where they can start pulling threads and saying, oh, okay, it's not Alaska, it's Boeing. Okay, it's not Boeing, it's Aerosystems. They can start putting those threads and getting concrete information around it. Whereas the everyday person on Twitter or X, they see it, they're shocked by it. It probably, it permeates their mind and it changes how they see the brand. But at the same time, there is such a deluge of shocking content these days on social media that to a certain extent, they almost move on a little bit. And I think if you remember, there was a lot of other stories competing for attention in that week. You had the Willy Wonka experience in Glasgow. You had all the speculation around Kate Middleton. There was a lot to take people's attention in that moment. But one of the other reasons why the Kate Middleton example is actually quite relevant is because having said that, journalists are often limited by what they can say when there's a bit more speculation, clearly the inverse is true when it comes to the public. So the initial blowout incident was shocking. They moved on. Whereas this whole story around the whistleblower, which was obviously incredibly controversial, incredibly ridden with holes, given that there's certain things that can't be communicated, there were certain facts that have not been established yet. That created a space for people to speculate and speculate and speculate. And certainly what I've seen recently when investigating trends on social media is two things guaranteed to inflame a lot of interest and attention are people feeling like they can act as sleuths and deduce the stuff themselves, but also people feel like there's a wrong that needs righting. And this ticked both of those boxes. Of course, circling back, to Kelly's point as well, this was also something that was quickly projected into the wider world. And that was partly because of social media. So that first spike, part of that was propelled by these two posts, which were actually done by people on the plane. And you don't have to look that far back, human history to think this would have seemed a crazy, crazy thing for people to be doing. But you had you had a tweet or a tweet, I don't know what they're called these days. And you also had a TikTok post, both from people who said, not only was I here, but also here's, pictorial evidence of me being here. And then that creates a symbiotic relationship with the press. So we saw that ABC article saying, here's pictures of what it looked like inside. They get access to pictures that even in the recent past, they wouldn't have done because of things like social media. And so the one really turbocharges the other. But I also wanted to show this video, and then I'd like to invite Kelly to comment on this video as well. And that talks a bit about what does it look like beyond Boeing? And this was a video we put together, which some of you may have seen, some have not. What this video does is it looks in relative terms at how other brands were very much drawn into this wider conversation. So it wasn't just about Boeing. It also was about Alaska Airlines at first. People very quickly got wise to the fact that this was maybe a Boeing problem, not an Alaska Airlines problem. It moved on to Airbus, their competitors, who we see like gradually mentioned throughout, because people think, well, this reflects quite well upon you guys. But also it features some maybe slightly less intuitive brands you might not have expected to see. You might have seen there Apple and Tesla. Now for Apple, this was very much a PR win. One of their phones fell from the sky and was found basically completely unbroken, working just fine on the ground. And this is clearly like, a great piece of PR for Apple and the durability of their products. With Tesla, it gets a little bit more interesting. So Tesla were inserted into the story because Elon Musk, obviously very much to do with Tesla and X, he commented on the DE&I policies at Boeing being perhaps to blame for the lack of engineering quality, the lack of rigor paid to it. But also there was an interesting thing going on where the stock price of Tesla was not doing particularly well at that time, and it was being linked to Boeing in a lot of conversation. So there is a school of thought that maybe Elon Musk came out with this confrontational statement so that when people saw, Tesla and Boeing, it was him making this very large statement, not people seeing all these things. Tesla and Boeing stocks, are the two most underperforming stocks in this week. Clearly, that obviously suggests a lot of forethought and maybe a lot of manipulation of conversation, which sometimes just isn't happening. You don't want to assign more meaning than isn't there. But what is true is that statement did detract or did distract people from the aforementioned fact. Kelly, I think obviously this is very emblematic of where modern media landscape's going, right? This is it's a much more complicated picture than it might once have been.
And I think this is kind of one of the questions. I mean, first of all, those tweets on the previous page, absolutely bonkers. I can imagine social media teams seeing those, and how do you dampen that out quickly enough, when those pictures are so dramatic. And this is where that combination between when we look at the social impacts with consumers through to the more kind of, I'd say, industry stakeholders begins to kind of get connected. Although Airbus here was spoken about quite positively, the biggest concern for most brands in this sector at this time would not necessarily be, of course, they would want to protect their own brand, but if the industry is seen as unsafe, then that is the bigger question. And so with kind of the brands kind of being in the actual kind of blowout of it and in that tailspin of the actual kind of conversation, it's how do they have to work together to repair the image of an industry, or work together to potentially settle things down without actually making some of the mistakes you just mentioned there. So when we talk about spokespeople, we've actually seen this in other industries, for example, with some of the work we've done. The recent banking collapse of SVB, for example, the Silicon Valley Bank, we saw within that kind of fallout a number of other banks get involved, and obviously the online panic matched a similar kind of theme, which was, is the banking industry going to collapse? Is it stable? I don't think people's memories had really left 2008. We all remember that time when we saw the banking systems around the world have that impact. So it really set off an online panic. And we saw some really big mistakes with spokespeople commenting at the time. And you mentioned about Elon Musk making a statement. You've got to be careful in these processes in this period. It's a very sensitive time, and any kind of comment or any kind of involvement in the media landscape, you could be impacting it in a way that will not necessarily benefit you in the long run. Mm-hmm. I don't think companies like Airbus will particularly be jumping up and down happy that they were mentioned more favorably in a situation where their industry was under such a spotlight for the wrong reasons. And often some of the photos and imagery, it can go in all directions. But the main thing is that when you are finding yourself in this, if you are a brand that is either connected or not connected, it really is trying to take a step back and think about it from an industry perspective, thinking about some of those other factors that you might need to take care of, like what is the message, what do people need to hear, what could potentially not be received well in terms of a message, or maybe not answering the questions you're getting asked. That's always a good one, because it can actually make the whole thing suddenly turn on its heels on you as well.
Yeah, I think that point you raised there actually about Airbus not necessarily being happy because it hurts the whole industry actually ties in quite neatly with the next slide we have.
I mean, I'm sure they weren't unhappy, Alex. I'm sure that they, but it is a bigger question for everybody, right? Especially in that duopoly.
Yeah, I think it comes down to not having choice, right? So, you don't say, oh, I want to fly on a Boeing flight versus an Airbus flight. You just might get a bit scared about flying in general. And that kind of brings us to this, right? Which is the ripple effect and the longer term impact of something like this. Like here, we took a bit of a sample of some of the biggest Google trend search about, Google searches about Boeing. And there was many, many more than this, and they all trended in this direction, which was very negative, to be honest. So can Boeing be trusted? Can Boeing fly with one engine? These are not questions you want people to be searching before they, board a plane or think about booking a flight with you. Similarly about Boeing as a brand, like, will Boeing collapse? Will Boeing stock ever go back up? Some of this is quite transient, and you would anticipate some of these, will fade away, but some of them won't. Some of them might stick around. And if you run this analysis in 6 months' time, I'm sure it will stabilize to an extent, but you'll also probably have a few things that suggest some real lasting damage from this. I mean, Kelly, obviously we talk about trying to contain things like this, but I mean, can Boeing contain something like this, or has it already got a bit beyond them?
I think, first of all, we need to have a bit of realism around the industry. But first of all, there was one website, I think it's Kayak, who turned around and said that they had a 50% increase in people searching, because you can search for the plane that you're booking on. So there was an increase, obviously, in concern around that. However, like you said, you don't have a choice in every market, and that's unfortunate. That's the system. But in terms of will Boeing ever recover, there are no certainties in this world, but I would be very surprised if we did not see Boeing recover. I think with the fact that it is such a big, important exporter in the States, I think we will see the government itself will want to see it bounce back. I wouldn't say bailout, but that's not completely impossible. There have been some, light-winded comments around the fact that maybe there would be, and some kind of intervention if they did kind of really go fall down. But the thing is with Boeing, it is also the fact that it is a huge, the aviation industry is incredibly important globally, and every single country relies on it for economic development and growth. Boeing is important, but also they're very tapped into the Chinese market. There is some other airline kind of manufacturers that are involved in China. There is one particular one that I'm sure the American market would not want to give business away to, or jobs. So I don't think we will see the death of Boeing out of this. But what will be really interesting, and the most fascinating part that I think will be worth watching, is the recovery, the brand reputation recovery that we will see. I will have a medium term and a long term. The medium term has already been set in stone with the CEO heading out the door at Christmas. What I would say is, now, if you look at the media kind of coverage around that and around the CEO role, there's so much speculation on who's going to take that job, and so much speculation about who is the person that's going to come in and turn this ship or plane around, And so it's going to be fascinating to watch, while they are not able to almost PR themselves because of that credibility issue, how they begin to do that and develop that over time, in order to have a resurgence around their actual brand, and hopefully, in part, support their customers who have a lot of their planes. It's also worth noting as well that Airbus have sold out of all their planes up until 2030. So they are, as I mentioned, they are 60% of the market. So Boeing has capacity, they have stock, so they have, and although there is some delays ahead because of what's happened, there will be availability. And I just don't think the globe has the time to wait for more stock, when it is often attached to so many of the fundamental growth elements for each of those countries.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I actually didn't realize that about the Airbus stock, Kelly. And maybe that's quite a nice place as well for us to park our plane, our Boeing plane, for the time being, because I really want to get Alex talking on reputation intelligence in just a moment. And before we do that, I just wanted to actually segue there by touching briefly on something that might seem like a bit of a hard left turn, but I'm hoping you'll stay with me for a moment. And that is Andrew Huberman. Now, if you know him, you're probably thinking, why has this come up? If you don't know him, you're probably thinking, well, who's this? Andrew Huberman is a wellness and science influencer based out of the University of Stanford. And there was a huge expose in New York Mag on him a couple of weeks ago. which basically outlined accusations that he had about 5 or 6 partners concurrently, keeping them all separate to each other. Now, he's become a very, very influential figure in podcasting and in social media generally as well. So this was very big news, especially given that a lot of his persona is built on things like self-control, on things like a modern view, you could argue, of masculinity. Certainly that's what it aspires towards. But then, why are we showing this? Why are we showing this chart? The main reason is because it kind of shows something that Boeing doesn't have. So it's almost proving a negative to a certain standpoint. It's also showing how the reputation lens can be cast a little bit wider than what we've been showing. And that is, we look here, and when I say we, it's Sal and my team. They've written a brilliant blog on this. You can check out on the site if you'd like to afterwards. This looks at the top 50 posts all around the Huberman backlash. And the first thing that comes out is the backlash to the backlash is actually the far larger force here. So there are certainly people criticizing him. There are people who think it's quite funny, but we also see some of the biggest posts of people who come out and support him and say, like, I know this man, or else like I know what he's done for me, or else I know what his persona means to me, and I think this is like slurs. I think this is like a hit job. And this is something that you just don't see with Boeing. You don't see people coming out to bat for them. Now, to a certain extent, you could argue, well, naturally, this is an influencer, someone whose whole thing's built on personality versus, a B2B brand. But I think you could also place a lot of brands on a sliding scale here. You look at something like Apple, there are no shortage of advocates for a brand like Apple, whereas MO is something like innovation. So with Boeing, it's partly the case that, of course, it's a B2B brand. It doesn't have that consumer-facing element that either an influencer or a fun brand like an Apple or a lot of tech companies, a fashion company might do. But at the same time, it's also because Boeing's brand identity to this point has been so predicated on efficiency, on reliability, on doing these things at scale. It has obviously those military links, those links to the US government. So when your core proposition is pulled out from underneath you in this way, it can be very damaging for a brand because people almost feel quite angry and let down. Boeing in their life, it means for a lot of people, it's meant stability. It's meant something you can rely on. And then without that, what does it mean? And I think, clearly Boeing does not need the same wealth of affection that someone like Huberman or like a fashion brand needs to operate, right? Like it just needs the right suppliers in the right places to be placing orders. But this stuff does mean it's so much harder for them to get any ground back because their advocates are so far and few between. Okay, cool. I know we've gone through on time quite a lot now, so just beyond the half hour. So perhaps without further ado, it's time to introduce Alex and unleash him upon everyone who's here. Alex, you want to start off by letting us know, what reputation intelligence is and how you think about it?
Yeah, for sure. Well, I guess the easiest way is to talk through a little bit of the methodology as a starting point. Reputation intelligence would essentially be the measurement of a brand's reputation through the tools that Pulsar has. So within digital conversations, but recently obviously expanding into broadcast, print, TV, podcasts as well. And at the core of that methodology is broadly kind of three steps that allow us to measure and monitor reputation on an ongoing basis. So naturally, we can start with the data collection, defining the universe within which you're going to measure reputation. Typically, this would involve a topic search on Pulsar Track, and that would be collecting any mention of your brand, its products or services, and potentially prominent figures or leadership from the brand as well across all of those channels that I just mentioned and that you can access through Pulsar. Of course, there's also a benefit here to benchmarking and contextualizing your reputation against relevant industry benchmarks. So often this setup will also extend to direct competitors or even potentially aspirational brands within your sector or elsewhere as well. Now, with reputation intelligence, we might also want to define what we consider to be relevant to reputation, and we can align that to a number of different criteria. So this could be potentially a bespoke, internally understood framework that the company itself has established, perhaps a recognized global definition of reputation that do exist, or in some instances, we may consider any mention of a brand to be relevant to reputation. Essentially, what we're saying here is the topics and themes that a given company might consider to be relevant to its reputation might differ. And this will be influenced by industry characteristics, brand positioning, regulatory environments, customer bases, particularly as in the Boeing example with a mostly B2B brand versus an alternative that might be mostly B2C, and of course other factors that might influence that as well. Reputation intelligence in pharmaceuticals, for instance, might prioritize regulatory compliance, scientific research, patient testimonials, whereas a sportswear manufacturer might focus more on the attributes of its products or potentially its sponsorship activities and environmental footprint, as an example. Sorry, let's just jump back onto that one before there. Yeah. So in terms of identifying that relevant content within your brand or category search, the possible approaches through which we might do this might vary from fairly accessible keyword filter based approaches requiring relatively little advanced development, all the way up to machine learning led classifications based on human annotated data, or NLP processes using pre-trained and fine-tuned models to understand the semantics within language. Naturally, the more advanced we get there, the more rigor and accuracy we can build in. But just to say, it can also be far more accessible than that as well. And then the final point here is to say that once we've identified and filtered for that relevant content, that content is then scored based on certain characteristics of the content to provide a reputation score. And the accumulation of that content can be aggregated to assess the state of a brand's overall reputation at a given time, with those industry benchmarks used to contextualize scores against the historical performance of comparable brands. And the final thing I'll add on that as well is that, of course, we can further filter that back to the original dimensions of reputation that you've identified, and also model the impact of prior content on your reputation today. In the example of Boeing here, as Alex mentioned, we expect the perception of Boeing that has been impacted by this event to last beyond the immediate news cycle of the event. In the next few weeks, as we know, it's going to play out over at least until Christmas with the change of the CEO.
Yeah, that's what you get for drawing breath, Alex. I just skipped straight ahead. So obviously what you're outlining seems a bit less like, say, open heart surgery on like a moving target. Like, we've obviously outlined some of these things as they happen, and everything's very like scary and exploding around you. And this is a bit more, I guess, in terms of like a longer term preventary program, right? Something almost like promotes good brand health. Is that fair? And if so, how would that fit into like a broader program? We're looking at measurement and monitoring and all those things.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think obviously a real benefit of social listening is it is real time, it's unsolicited, it's an instant feedback data source, and as such can act as that kind of early warning system for how things are going to impact your brand's reputation. And I think in that respect, the process that we've just spoken about really provides that bleeding edge view of reputational impact that then maybe more traditional data sources might detect further down the line in as the fallout plays out. But extrapolating this further, we can also then leverage a more kind of extrospective view of topical conversations around the issues that are kind of critical to your brand and industry, and use that as an early warning system for issues that might be coming down the line. So if you consider, in the spirit of preparedness and also facilitating speed of response to these issues, having an eye on what is upstream to your business can obviously be beneficial. If you're Airbus in this situation, for instance, the reputational impact that impacts your brand via the industry, naturally this was triggered by a very, very real event that occurred. But in other instances, that might be something that plays out over a longer period of time. So equally, the same. But so if you consider, for instance, how societal issues such as inflation and the cost of living have drawn intense scrutiny on energy industry profits, or how topics such as climate change, the energy transition, and sustainability, which are inherently critical for the energy sector, these topics are discussed at such a large scale that direct mentions of energy companies contribute only a small portion of the conversation. So monitoring and understanding these broader societal conversations, how the narratives are shifting within those, and who the engaged audiences are, becomes an equally important part of reputation research. as the I say simple, but the more straightforward measuring and monitoring of topics. So the example here on the slide, for instance, is a map of semantically distinct topic clusters for digital well-being. So if you're a tech company or a policymaker or educator, how do you kind of navigate this broad conversation to understand the perception shifts that are impacting your category, and how do you use that to then kind of better understand how you might land your messages that are intended to shape your reputation within that conversation when the conversation has departed somewhat from what is regularly your kind of day-to-day conversation and audience. So yeah, I mean, in this example, we'd probably conduct advanced topic and narrative analysis of these conversations, helping us to identify the evolving needs and perceptions of topic or category audiences, identify which of those narratives might need attention based on their potential to grow in terms of volume, but also in terms of how they might spread between audience communities. And then, digging into this further to really help us identify where the entry points are for us to enhance credibility, influence, and ultimately reputation. And I think the Boeing example was a prime case for this. Again, I think, as a primarily B2B business whose customers may historically be airlines, cargo operators, and government, but who is now facing a very real crisis that in some part is playing out among end users of its product who retain some influence over the business through their purchasing power, through their voting power, and also just through their social presence and ability to have a voice, which maybe 30 years ago they may have been prevented from. So, how do they engage with this conversation, given, as I said, it's kind of removed from what might have been their regular day-to-day discourse?
Yeah, it's so interesting seeing it all laid out like this, because it almost feels like the kind of visualization you want to print out and have on a wall. But if you could read it, it's probably telling you like, no, panic, everything's going wrong. Okay, so obviously one thing we maybe haven't touched on in great depth so far is the audiences, and we're an audit intelligence company, so that's maybe the component that would be awesome to explain a bit more now, Alex.
Yeah, for sure. So naturally, an audience or an understanding of your audience is a critical element of any reputation intelligence framework. We touched on it again just then with the Boeing example, and Pulsar's capabilities in this field really allow us to do that at a granular level. So this would typically involve segmenting audiences based on their shared interests and affinities, and that allows us to identify distinct audience communities within either your direct brand conversation, or, as we mentioned, within that broader topical or societal conversation around those issues that are important to you. And then within those audiences, we might find that there's a specific audience, or maybe multiple audiences, who are detractors or advocates for your brand or for your point of view within a given space, and also those who occupy a potentially movable middle ground. This example on the slide here is stolen from one of your team's reports, Alex, but I think illustrates that point quite well, that you've got audiences here who potentially, just through their characteristics, don't necessarily exhibit a point of view outwardly, but in terms of the language they use around a topic, some of these can be identified as more hopeful or optimistic towards an issue, in this case sustainability, or those who are on the other end of the spectrum. And kind of understanding these audiences, who those individuals are, whether their influence on the overall conversation is pervasive or more confined to the niche kind of circles that they exist within, really helps to understand how different audiences might impact your business. And then equally, each of these audience communities has distinct engagement patterns, communication preferences. So when you're talking to these audiences, understanding their interests, concerns, needs, online behaviors in terms of how they consume content can naturally lead to more effective messaging in terms of the placement of that messaging, the timing, the tone of voice, its format, and also its design, its visual, how it engages people, just as reaching them through a topical conversation that they truly care about. For Boeing, maybe it's the safety issue, people who would previously be traveling often, maybe they're now slightly apprehensive. Is this the topic that has the relevant entry point for you to communicate around? Or is there potentially influencers, external voices who can deliver that message for you in a way that is credible and understandable to the audience that you're trying to reach and influence? And you know, in terms of navigating these brand crises that exist and that do play out, you really require that nuanced understanding of how to engage with different audiences, particularly those who are influenceable to your point of view, and those that have a broader reach and influence over the topic conversation. So, you know, should you be addressing these issues head on, or is it sometimes wiser to step back and recalibrate? And you can, you know, learn about all of these things through the way that audiences engage and behave around past crises or around similar topics and issues that they discuss.
Well, brilliant. I mean, thank you, Alex. Thank you for taking us through that. That obviously brings us to the end of the presenting part of this webinar, but we'd love to leave some time at the end for any questions people might have had over the course of it. Like, I think a few people have been dropping them into either the Q&A or the chat as we've been talking, but should any occur to you now based on what you've heard, please do feel free to throw them in. Obviously, you know, I'm probably best placed to talk about like the Boeing data set we had, Kelly on like the broader implications and the PR lens on that, and then Alex on the reputation intelligence work he was able to share with us just now. If I go through, Alex, actually, question to you, given that you've just come hot off the press there. You know, how do you make that decision on what counts as worthwhile conversation to count in your analysis? Because I think what this person's saying here is there must be a lot of conversation, right? Not all of which is going to be relevant.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a number of different ways, and it will obviously depend on the specific scenario and the research objectives. I think if you're talking about within your brand conversation, then the reputation measurement that we have is inherently a good function for that. Is someone talking in a particularly negative or, you know, harmful way about your brand? But often that's also something that's already impacting your brand, and to some extent you'll be aware of it by that point, by the time by the time we're talking to a client about it. And so there's also the view of kind of what's coming down the pipeline. In various examples for this, we've used kind of established frameworks for what might be considered a risk within an industry. You know, do you see people, in the case of Boeing, as you know, presumably they would have done, do you see people talking about the safety of air travel? So do you see these topic conversations emerging and growing in areas that you know are going to form a risk to your brand? Equally, if something's being discussed by particular stakeholders, so people closer to the purchasing power in your industry, or if they're talking about direct competitors to yourself, all of these things are going to be indicators of something that is more likely to have a direct impact on your own brand reputation, as it's kind of closer to you at that point already.
Interesting. And I guess actually rolling that on to Kelly for a second, I suppose that when it comes to something like media placement and media coverage, because it's just by definition going to be so much smaller, you probably care a bit more about everything, I would imagine. Like, there's probably very little you would just let go. It's probably like, doesn't matter what publication it's on, you want to be aware of it.
Yes, but there will definitely be a tiered approach to kind of, and looking at the reach of those, you know, those different outlets, and whether they are going to be read by the people that matter to your kind of engagement with the press. Something I did want to mention, actually, just to kind of take a step backwards around the research that Alex shared. It's incredibly important for other teams to know that audience intelligence and what's going on online. So, for example, I can imagine how useful that is to government affairs people, because often they are the ones who are engaging with politicians, elected officials, regulators, and that audience in itself and that group of stakeholders are hugely interested in public perception, public feeling, because they are there to deliver for the public. And often I do think that is missed, that we think that, why would they need to know that level of audience intelligence? Why would this matter? Why would this help them? It'd be incredibly helpful. And I would just implore anybody who is kind of leading on that area in a brand to really think about who else outside of maybe their own team, like, for example, other external communications teams that might be dealing with a specific segment or specialization, how it might work for them. And again, same on the media side as well. I think with the media audience, the tone, the reaction to certain messages, certain phrases, and how it's adopted online and how it's reacted to online can help build playbooks should you ever find yourself in that position. And we find that trying to triangulate all this information together, you can really begin to build something quite special should you find yourself in that position. Should you feel that you need to brief spokespeople and tell them what to avoid, you're going to have the evidence there to back it up, and it's going to be very well shared between those different groups, different teams responsible for different stakeholders at that point.
Yeah, there's certainly all brilliant points to bear in mind. In terms of other questions, we've got one from Victor here, who said, was X/Twitter, I think we're all kind of still adapting to the new naming, the platform where the social conversation developed most significantly, or did it also spread across others like Facebook, Instagram, etc.? That's a really good question. Yeah, I think, here we use X, as we often do, as a bit of a signifier, as a bit of like a signal to compare against news, but you could equally have done it against Reddit, against TikTok, against Facebook, Instagram. There's a couple of elements there. One is they all had that initial spike, right? They're all reacting to the same thing. But then what happens afterwards is what makes it particularly interesting. And that's this fact that, these each host very different types of conversation. So Twitter obviously is a really good vehicle and vector for things like, a lot of news publications use it as a way of like getting their story out there. So obviously we all know there's a lot of journalists, etc. on it. But one thing we noticed a lot this time was that all those articles people have been writing for the last 5 years, like, but I have to watch out for Boeing, or Boeing needs to be careful of this. Everyone who's written those articles, or everyone who's read those articles and remembered them, were using Twitter to re-up them. So there was almost a big like memory machine thing going on Twitter. And that was a really interesting like sub narrative that was happening over there. Whereas Reddit is clearly a little bit different. Reddit, a lot of these subreddits presuppose, quite a high knowledge, some of them, about what goes into making a plane. So you might have something like one level of Boeing conversation that's taking place on something very much to do with stocks, where everyone just cares very much that the stock's gone down. What does this mean for my holding? But then you might have another subreddit, which is almost entirely populated by people who work creating airplanes and the engines, all that stuff. And the conversation there is people saying, yes, 10 years ago, I worked on this project and I saw this and this. Some people saying, yeah, this system they use was always going to be an issue. So that's obviously an interesting type of conversation we see. And then, you pull it all the way out to something like TikTok, which is much more, you see obviously initially that video that went very viral and like the actual blowout itself. But then you also see like a lot more memes, a lot more humor, a lot of people like comparing themselves to Boeing, right? A lot of people doing it humorously, saying like, oh, my life is falling apart, like I'm a Boeing plane and stuff like that. Like, this is the kind of stuff you'll see a lot more on TikTok, but also, on the likes of Facebook, where we see a slightly older audience sharing stuff within like their family groups, within their communities of interest, etc. It's one of the things that makes it so interesting for us to look into, right? Like all of these just to go zooming off in different directions. And occasionally you'll find that commonality, and occasionally you'll just end up on such different planes, no pun intended. Got one question here from Matt. And maybe actually I'll bounce one over to you initially, Kelly. Was there anything Boeing could or should have done to manage this better? I mean, it's $1 million question. I guess if you were able to answer this, you'd probably be.
I mean, there was one thing that I thought was quite questionable, which I'm not sure whether, I'm sure it was well researched with the amount they must have been spending on crisis comms at this point. When they were getting pushed a lot of questions pushed towards them around about some of these key scenarios that were beginning to happen on multiple different flights. And they said they would not comment on the safety of it and referred them back to the airlines. And I'm just not sure whether that was a little bit reactive. I appreciate they can't answer on issues of safety and protocols that the airlines are responsible for. I just wonder whether it would have been better to say no comment and than say we can't, you should refer you back to the airlines at that point, because I think it really was their problem at the time. So that's the only kind of real thing that I think I would fairly comment on, whether that was a great start. But apart from that, I think it was a very unique scenario, and hindsight is a beautiful thing. I think others will learn more from this. So Boeing have given a gift to others that if you can track what's happened here, it's going to teach a lot of other people how they would manage it, how they would build a playbook for a similar scenario. So that's what I think.
Yeah, I agree. Sometimes it can be very easy to be wise from the sidelines when you've got a tool like Pulsar and you see the whole conversation laid out and you think, gosh, why didn't they just do this or that? But certainly, as you say, Kelly, it's a difficult situation they wouldn't expect to deal with. I suppose the one thing from my side, which I noticed, which you could mention, is if you cast your mind back to we had that news chart which showed that there was a huge amount of conversation about them in industry publications and stuff for a long time before then. I think once this happened, it was like out of their control. But when that was happening, and it was a lot of smaller publications, people they could have approached with narrative, they could have seeded narratives, they could have approached these people a bit more, they could have formed relationships. Again, I'm not going to pretend to have any special insight into what they were doing beforehand, but you would imagine, looking at what we saw here, there was a large opportunity there for them to slightly impact that narrative. And it kind of goes back to what Alex was saying as well, right? It's very rarely after the fact. So you have crisis comm specialists who are there after the fact. But the vast array of PR teams is kind of putting these things in place beforehand, and it's like setting the ship on a very steady. So we're absolutely loving the ship metaphors in this webinar. The setting yourself on putting yourself in the right place to succeed, I suppose, is how I'd put that.
Just with that, however, I do think about where we might be sat here thinking about this in a year's time, because how many, especially a younger audience, really thought about whether they were on an Airbus or a Boeing plane. Did we ever really think about that? Was that ever really in the consciousness? I don't think it massively was. But what will that mean for them when their brand does bounce back? What's the potential for that awareness now that they have a public awareness? And I'm intrigued to see what being thrown into the spotlight, albeit for the wrong reasons, can then do long term to brand recognition and potentially just the attractiveness of them as a company as a whole.
Yeah, that's very true. We've probably not got a huge amount of time, so please feel free to answer any more questions and ask any more questions, and we'll endeavour to ping you replies. The one I'd like to get to before we leave today is this one from Stephanie, who asks, does the rise of cancel culture and social media activism present on social media platforms complicate companies such as Boeing's efforts to recover from crises? I suppose obviously there's a lot contained within that question. Like when we talk about things like social media activism, it's all really is a massive topic. I guess the couple of things that maybe I'd share that I found that might be relevant is, clearly this is happening against the context of the conflict out in the Middle East. And obviously Boeing are in a particular position as someone who has historic ties and current ties to the US military and factors like that. So it kind of created a bit of a perfect storm. I think we definitely saw some communities who were very engaged in that conversation about the conflict were sending messages to the effect of, everyone is freaking out about this, but what about them doing that? And there's kind of two ways to look at that, I guess. One is, gosh, this is mutating into a crisis beyond all control, because now people are claiming you're incompetent, but they're also claiming you're potentially a bit morally unsound or really ramming that narrative home. Of course, the other way of looking at it is for Boeing, it's getting everything negative out in one go, which I know is something that often brands, when they feel like they've gone beyond a certain point, can actively look to do, right? It's like, just get everything bad out in one moment and we'll go from there. So that's certainly one impact. And then as far as, things like social media activism go, one thing we mentioned was the furore that attached to Elon Musk's messages. And that clearly created a bit of like a flashpoint for these types of conversation, right? And it basically made it a bit of a culture wars, frontier on the culture wars. And I think in some ways you could almost argue that was, and again, I do want to overreach, but there was some ways that was almost quite helpful for Boeing, because we made the mention that people aren't really going out to bat for them. I think as soon as someone like Musk makes it this is because of DE&I policies, that was probably the one time that you would say maybe some people are going out to bat for Boeing, because people want to obviously bat for that idea, right? They want to bat for that idea of a society in which you have those policies and viewpoints like Musk's are opposed. So yeah, clearly I'm not going to be able to. None of us, I think, are going to get into the weeds of social activism as a whole. But there was a couple of things we noticed there that we certainly found interesting. We are coming up to the hour now. I think we've had very good attendance throughout, so very appreciative of everyone who's turned up, who's listened to us talk. If you have any questions on any of the above, because I know we've explored quite a lot of different things, so whether that's Kelly's outlook on the different PR crises, whether that's everything Alex covered about reputation intelligence, please do send us an email. You should be able to reply to the emails you've received from us in the lead up to the event, and we're very happy to pick up a conversation, whether that's email or on a call, whatever. So yeah, I'll just finish by saying thank you again to Kelly and Alex, and thank you everyone for joining us.